Our next panel is titled Driving Towards Systemic Success, Tried and True Equity and Inclusion Practices in the Workplace. A little bit about today's panel is our panel is led by Tennille Boyer, Global Diversity and Inclusion Lead for Blue Ocean Brain. Tennille works very closely with DE&I and L&D leaders to help develop solutions regarding critical topics, including allyship, empathy, unconscious bias. So Tennille's going to lead today's discussion and drive everything for us with these three amazing panelists representing Zimmer Biomet, Lockheed Martin, and Major League Baseball. So I'll have Tennille take it from here and allow you guys to self-introduce and get right into it. All right? Thank you.
Thanks, Charlene. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having us. It's great to be here. My name is Tennille. I work with Blue Ocean Brain, and we're one of the vendors here today. We kind of stay in our swim lane around ongoing learning opportunities. So I'm excited to get to chat with these three around some of the policies and systems side of the process that I don't get to dig into as much. So we have three awesome folks with us today. And I don't know if you want to just take a really quick pass around. We can go Justin, James, Georgia, because that's how I'm seeing you on the screen, to just do a quick intro and then we'll jump in.
Sure, I'm happy to start us off. Justin Reyes, Vice President, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with Major League Baseball. Started here in November, so it's really been an exciting time for us in this space.
Hi, everybody. I'm Georgia Coffey. I'm the Director of Global Diversity and Inclusion for Enterprise Operations for Lockheed Martin Corporation. Very, very proud to be with you today. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having me. James Cheng with Zimmer Biomet. I'm the Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Awesome. Well, one of the things that we had all talked about in advance is we really wanted this to be, very conversational. And the goal is that, you all take away a bunch of awesome nuggets, right, from this conversation. So, but because they all three have such really awesome and unique backgrounds, I did want to at least kind of start off with some leading questions, one for each, so that we can make sure we're getting all of this goodness that they have to offer in this session. So, Georgia, I'll start with you. You have a really unique perspective, just having served in the public sector for so long, most notably under Obama, which I noticed the awesome picture behind you.
Oh yeah, by design, by the way, Tennille. That is not accidental.
Listen, I'd have the same thing if I had that. But you've had such a big focus on policy in your career, and so kind of moving to the private sector, I think it'd be really interesting to hear kind of how the work you've done there has really informed the way you've structured new policies and practices in your role here at Lockheed.
Sure. Thanks, Tennille. And thanks to my co-panelists. I know we're going to have an interesting conversation today. Yeah, it's true. As Tennille mentioned, the bulk of my career was in the public sector. I am a public servant at heart. I still consider myself a public servant being with Lockheed Martin, I must tell you, because so much of the work of Lockheed Martin is for national security and space exploration and so many other wonderful cutting edge things. In terms of how my perspective is formed, you're very right in saying that the public sector experience really had a major imprint on how I approach diversity and inclusion. One of the differences, and if I could distill it down to something very easy, one of the differences between public sector and private sector is that public sector has one common denominator in terms of defining its success. So we just heard some definitions of success in the previous segment. And the one common denominator, despite how different all of the cabinet level departments are in the federal government, that one common denominator is equity. Think about it. None of our agencies, whether they're doing health and human services, transportation, veteran support, which is where I most recently came from, all of those agencies cannot consider themselves successful in the delivery of their mission unless they do so fairly for every constituent out there, for every citizen out there. So it was that mindset that I brought with me to Lockheed Martin, and I'm very pleased to say Lockheed Martin was very progressive in terms of its commitment to diversity and inclusion. I'll just sort of end with one quick nugget of a concrete example of one thing I brought with me. And it's going to sound wonky, and I apologize. It's going to sound very governmenty. But the truth of the matter is I think it was very, very impactful. And that is to start with a good metrics-based strategic plan. I had noticed that all of our agencies and many companies, of course, probably all companies, have some kind of a corporate strategy. In government, we had strategic plans at very high levels for various different disciplines. But in my experience, none were devoted exclusively for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I felt it needed its own focus, its own strategic objectives, and most importantly, its own metrics. So I would say that's one key strategy that I brought to Lockheed Martin, was to develop our own multi-year strategic plan exclusively focused on those three goals: equity, diversity, inclusion, and then of course complementing it with measurable objectives and strategies and initiatives, so we can see, have we had an impact? Have we moved the needle at all?
We could probably spend the whole time talking about that element and the metrics alone, because I think if there's one thing that I hear every single day on calls is, are we measuring the right things? What should we be measuring? Right. And some of the parts of what you measure are kind of squishy in the D&I space, and it's not always as easy as when you're looking at recruiting metrics or something like that. So I know we could spend a ton of time there. But, sure. Justin, I would love to toss to you, because, you've had a lot of experience in kind of starting, D&I initiatives at different companies and different industries as well. And I know, especially in my universe, the last 6 to 8 months, I'm speaking with a ton of, maybe L&D leaders who are assuming this part-time, full-time job of trying to bring D&I to life inside their organization in response to current events. And so I'd love to hear, your advice on when companies are kind of at that beginning stage, where should they be focusing?
Thank you, Tennille, and thank you, everyone. Look, I think to your point, 6 to the last 12 months, we've seen such exponential growth of the diversity community, whether it's a dedicated D&I leader, or whether it's a hand raiser, or someone who's deeply passionate, or an organization that's committed to it but just might not know how. And I've been fielding any number of these questions on a fairly regular basis. Where do we start? What do we look at? What's the right way? What's the right approach, right? Do we get a dedicated diversity leader? Do we not? Do we form a committee? Do we form a council? Do we form BRGs? Or do we start with ERGs? Really, I guess the where people often start is around recruitment, right? Because I think it's the most visible, and you look around your office and you're saying, okay, what are we doing about this? The question is, what does the ecosystem look like? What is culturally appropriate for your organization, right? Like Georgia, having spent so much time in one sector and transitioning now into sports, having spent some time primarily in financial services, with a couple of years in media before making a transition into sports, you have to find culturally what's the right approach for your organization, right? There's no one size fits all. My advice to many is to seek out that professional experience, that resource that can help you build. And where you start is largely up to what your commitment as an organization is, how you can build an ecosystem around the kinds of infrastructure and the policies and the practice that your organization can see through to fruition. The leadership buy-in, of course, is hugely important. So from top down, how do we approach a top-down plan to track and measure accountability, to George's point, identify success, and then bottom up to elevate and raise awareness and empower and mobilize your employees to help drive the change throughout the organization. So, when we look at it, we're specifically for baseball, we're focused on our people, our culture, and our community, and all of that really working together. So our people is the representation, the community is the culture and the climate and the resources and the employee networks, and our community is how we're facing externally and how we're partnering with our vendors and our suppliers and our community partners. All of that has to work together. So, I think that if there's anything that I can share with anyone that's out there in this journey, either just beginning or is looking to build but just might not know how, I think the secret there is work it all together. There's no one thing that you can run at that would not have an impact, right? I can go out and recruit top diverse talent, but if they're not staying, then culturally what do we need to change, right? If we're not engaging our local communities and our partners, then and using our employee networks and all of the resources that we have available to help drive all of this together, you're going to have fits and starts. You're going to run at something and then realize that you reach a bottleneck or a ceiling that you can't cross. You build and then you might not have leadership buy-in. So you won't get as much done as you want to get done. And there's a level of frustration for many of us who have been in this space for a really long time around how far we want to go, how fast we want to go, what we feel needs to be changed, and the opportunities that we have available to us. So I would just say it's hard work. Stick with it. Seek out professional feedback, advice, consultancy, and just stick with it. Stick with it in every single day.
Yeah, I would say if I've learned anything the last several years talking to D&I leaders all the time is it's a close-knit network. They want to be helpful, like lean on those people, make connections, because there's so much, good experience that is existing for people who have been doing this work for a long time. James, you've been doing this work for, many, many years at different organizations. And I know kind of what, Justin's alluding to too, is kind of like, what is your framework when you look at your culture, your leadership buy-in, all these things that matter? What is that framework you're trying to put in place as a business that we're going to lean on at the end of the day? And I know we talked a little bit about kind of the principles, right? And where that comes in. And when we go through tough, polarizing years like this last year, for example, can you just share around, from your lens, the importance of kind of having those organizational principles and really where they fit in?
Absolutely. One of the key things when we think about our organizations, first, does the organization have a central value system or a culture in the organization that can be clearly defined, whether that would be a guiding principle, whether that's values, or even a very, very clear vision, right? And again, that depends on different organizations. There's as Georgia had mentioned, government has a different type of perspective versus nonprofit versus our private sectors. And even within different industries, there's a different purpose. I come from medical technology right now. Previously, I was in pharmaceutical. Again, still health driven. Their core view of everything is how does it impact patients, right? Versus my previous organization before that, which was in agriculture and biotechnology and basically conglomerate of different things. They're at the end goal, how do they feed the world? So again, people and populations in general. So when you think about a principle within an organization, first off, is your employees one of those core principles? Do you have a clear understanding of what the value of your people are to you in an organization? And people, there's a lot of fluff. I'm going to be very frank about this. Organization for many years has says, yes, people are important, but how? How are they important? Do they understand why they are important? And that principle piece of, well, main thing is they're the ones who drives the work. They're the one who brings in the ideas. Whether you're bringing new employees into the organization or you're empowering your existing employees to bring their life experiences to give you innovation, whatever it may be, is one of the core tenets in your principles, your team members, and truly maximizing their capability and talent. And we don't always have that clear. Again, let's be real. At one point in time, I have heard this many times before. Employees saying, I'm just a number. That you cannot say that has not happened in the past. And anyone who believes that, I question more often than not. So first off, again, do we truly understand the value of our employees, team member, whomever you want, whatever way you want to call it? And that will be one guiding principle that again, I would ask every leader in any organization to truly internalize and see, because you can say it, but are you actioning it? And when you think about actioning it, I tend to talk about when it comes to equity, driven into four primary pillars, at least for what I do. It's principles, practices, policies, and accommodation. When you break it down to those four areas, at least for my organization, you can see whether you are truly actioning it from a systems perspective, right? Do you actually have any values? Are you communicating on a regular basis? Are you making sure that your leaders are actually sharing it within their talent management discussions? Stuff like that. That can be measured, okay? When you think about practices, is it an inclusive hiring practice? Is there employee engagement measurements? There's so many things from a practice perspective that you can measure. Then you go into policies. Is your policies creating impact? Is it increase or decreasing employee relations cases and stuff like that? There's things you can measure within just that alone. And then ultimately, is your accommodation truly making it equitable for every employee in your organization to be successful? You can see that based on savings. You can see that in multiple measuring platforms. So when you think about it, if you break it down from an equity perspective, if you can hit those 4 areas, that all leads to the guiding principle of, yes, we're going to empower every employee or team member in a company.
Mm-hmm. And, if I may say, James, I think that's great that you wove together the concept of the importance of analytics, measurements with the culture, because you're right. It's easy for all of us to say we value our employees. That's a key cultural value, a corporate value. But are we really valuing them and we don't know that until we look at some of the metrics. And some metrics, Tennille, you were saying we could talk all day about metrics, and I promise you I won't, because I know that may glaze over to a lot of people. But one key metric is, let's hear from our employees themselves. And what I'm referring to here are employee climates, organizational climate surveys. Mm-hmm. For us, that's one of the key ways we can get to the heart of what are our employees actually feeling. Do they feel included? Do they feel a sense of belonging and empowerment in the organization? And the most efficient way we can get that is through our employee climate survey. And we do, and perhaps your organizations have this as well, we have actually developed an inclusion index where we can actually measure the trend of how our employees are feeling by organizational component about the extent to which they truly feel included. I want to bring in something that Justin said as well. He talked a lot about culture. And, culture is one of those amorphous things, but so critically important. You've all heard the term that culture eats strategy for lunch, and it absolutely does. I can have the most perfect strategic plan with all the perfect objectives, strategies, initiatives, and metrics, but if it's not something that can work within the culture of the organization, it's not worth the darn. So you really have to marry the two. You have to marry analytics with employee perceptions and get to that sweet spot where employees do feel that they are, in fact, a core value of the organization.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say too, one of the things that I get asked a lot is like, how frequently are you going out and asking your employees these things? What makes sense there? What's too frequent? What's not frequent enough? Because, so many folks who are signing the checks and all these awesome resources that are being put into place, right? They want to see, how did we move the needle? And certainly, to your point, marrying the data with that feedback is critical. But like, what is the right pace for getting that feedback and pulling that data together?
Tennille, for me, it's ask the organization, ask your employees, ask your resource networks, ask your HR leads. What would work for you? Look, wherever I've gone, there's that component organizationally on what would be the right way, the method that would be received in the way that people receive information. And then the second part of it, as a diversity practitioner myself, and someone who deeply, deeply cares about this work, and the communities that for so long have been marginalized, just want to be heard. Yeah. And so I've been, wherever I've gone, I've been a sounding board, right? It keeps us authentic. It keeps our organization, the D&I practice, because I can't pretend that I have every solution or every answer to meet someone, at their intersection of diversity. So I just don't know what it's like in certain areas. So I have to ask and say, well, does this resonate with you? Would this work? Is this something that you would receive, that you would take advantage of? Because, to George's point, we can build it. And if nobody uses it, and if it's not helpful to the organization, what would be the point? So I think that wherever I've gone, I've tried to keep my ear to the ground to say, what are we doing? Where are we going? How did you receive that senior level communication that just went out across the entire organization? Did that resonate with you? Do you want to know more of that? And I think, James, we were joking around not long ago where James is looking at these streams of work, and I think one of them is crisis. And we laughed about this, but how do we navigate situations that we're not necessarily prepared for? And how do we spark that conversation? How do we meet our employees at that, where it is that they need to be supported and to be heard and valued and rewarded and respected in a way that they feel like they belong? So I would say the short answer to that is I think it just ask, reach out, and from my experience, I think that you'll find that people want to have this dialogue, and probably more often than you would expect. I believe in now in this post-COVID world that we're all digital and we don't have those daily interactions with one another where we can just stop by somebody's desk or somebody's office. I feel that you can't over communicate in this environment. So I have daily team calls every morning, and I try to pull together as many people together on a regular basis as possible. I think that's how we learn.
That's great.
And there's been some good, go ahead, James. I was gonna say there's been some good questions. If you three don't have your chat box open, take a look because there's some good things coming in. But James, what were you gonna add?
I was gonna say I love where Justin went when it came to asking different people and getting the insight from your actual, whether it's constituents, your employees, whomever. One of the things that, as we think about it, we all have different intersectionalities that help drive who we are. I myself come from a background as a second generation Chinese American veteran, someone with invisible disability and LGBTQ. So that in itself lends to me how I hear things, how I see things, how I interpret things differently, right? But in the same time, just acknowledging that we're on the same path all together on a long journey, very realistic about that, and helping people understand that everyone should have a voice in the discussion, whether it's actioned upon, another story, but everyone should have a voice, and potentially that is your source. As Justin said, I just want to make sure I include that as a sense of everyone's diversity and the way that they view things are going to be different. And we know that, but them having a voice is what's important.
I want to, if I may, I think that's absolutely true, James, but if I may, one of the questions, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Takesha asked a really fascinating question that I can hopefully, respond with an interesting anecdote. She asked, how accurate are employee climate engagement surveys in homogeneous environments? Now, here's the funny thing about that. When I was in the public sector, we also did climate surveys and relied on them heavily for our input and assessment of our diversity and inclusion program. And one of the major bureaus that we were surveying was in fact an extremely homogeneous environment. I mean, I'll be candid with you, it was overwhelmingly white male in this organization. And interestingly, and this goes to your very insightful question, Takesha, we had the highest inclusion scores in that homogeneous organization. Now, what does that teach us? Be very careful what you ask, because if you just relied on the data, you would think, wow, this is a model organization. We've got to go to them to find out what are they doing to build such an inclusive environment whereby their employees are feeling so included. Well, of course they're all included. They're all the same, and they're all being accepted in the same in the same way. So I think that's an interesting question, and do be mindful of that. Very often you're going to get lower inclusion scores in more diverse organizations because by nature, there's going to be some conflict. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what we do about it, which sort of saves us. But thank you, Takesha, for that question. I thought it was very insightful.
And Georgia, maybe if I could piggyback off of that one, an experience that I've had in the past, in another world, in another life. What I do, what I pride myself probably in is in those conversations with those employees, surfacing how they're feeling. To James' point, right? It's that intersection and these dimensions of diversity that everybody brings in that I can have candid conversations with my senior leaders. So if you've got a homogeneous group, but you've got one person who's a LGBTQ veteran, first, second generation Asian, where I where this support system comes in, where this lens by which we view the work is I've looked at very senior leaders and I'm like, what do you think it's like to be James here?
Mhm.
Right? What do you think he feels every single day? And it's probably the first time that many of them are ever really asked that question. And so by grounding ourselves in the voice of the employee and the experience and that rich experience for how they feel they belong in the organization, to elevate and amplify that voice, to say, what can we be doing differently? What is it like for someone who's different in this culture? And what are we willing to do about it?
Right.
I think that's going to drive an incredible amount of change across our organization.
And to be very fair, what both of you had said about how that environment and those surveys could potentially be false flag at times. But the reality is, as you truly develop leaders to be inclusive, they will drive that score higher in general because they care, right? Fundamentally, when you think about it, the way I look at inclusion from a DEI perspective is intentional leadership, intentional involvement, and then intentional care. Because when you set it up that way for a leader, those are leaders who understand that they have vulnerabilities and they're willing to meet people where they are. They do not see themselves as higher than anyone else. They don't see themselves as, I'm your boss, you listen to me, versus how can I help you help yourself as well as help the organization, right?
Sure.
That approach alone creates a different type of environment that, again, compared to a homogeneous design, well, reality is if you're an inclusive environment, it doesn't matter who you are. If you feel like you have a voice, you feel included, you're going to contribute. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to lose that amazing opportunity. So at least that's
and so much of our job is to coach leaders there, right? They don't know what they don't know. So much of what we do is just a lens by which they can view what they do every single day.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. I love the word intentional. And I'll tell you why. When we are big believers in training and education. Hey, listen, we've all been to training that is not so good, but I will tell you, there is nothing more efficient to help change the culture of an organization than good experiential training. And one of the words that we use in our training, particularly when we're focusing on inclusion, is intentionality, because we know that inclusion and belongingness, and we'll talk about the subtle differences between those two words, those won't come naturally. Our brains as human beings, and I know you know this, Tennille, because I know a little bit about your organization and some of the training that you do. Inclusion and belonging are impacted by our unconscious bias or our implicit association. We are hardwired to have that. Doesn't make us evil people, it makes us human. The catch is we have to pause, we have to stop the amygdala, if I can get so, corny, from hijacking our thought process and bring it to the front of our brain and pause for intentional, rational thought. That's the only way you're going to get to inclusiveness, because it's not, by nature, it's not necessarily going to come naturally. We are not geared that way to step out of that comfort zone of where we've always been. So thank you, James, for bringing that point out. I think that's a key point.
And Georgia, I think so many of us, when we're running at these conversations, we want to say, and I think Tennille, this touches on the first question that you asked me, like, where do we start? So many people are like, I want to do unconscious bias training. and to James's point, it's like, well, why? And what problem are you trying to solve? And how can we, like why that and not something else? And so what I've been focused on probably over the course of the last 8 or 9 years is what's called conscious inclusion.
Yep.
It's taking unconscious bias, recognizing those points where Georgia says, hey, we're at an inflection point where we can choose to act differently. And then equipping our leaders and our managers and our employees to act differently in that space.
Sure.
Because I can't just tell you that here's a moment. I need to be able to equip you with the tools that you need to say, wow, you know what? I've got 5 roles open. I need to pause and figure out what I can do differently around this recruitment side. Or, let me step out of my default and choose to act differently. Now, look, you might still choose the same level of behavior, but the question is, have I checked myself and my what I perceive as my norms, and really evaluated all of the information to make the best decision possible? And that's, as leaders, we have to drive our organizations towards, right? We're always going to drive our organizations to make the best people and business decisions. That's what we do as organizations. The question is, do we have all of the inputs to make the necessary decisions? And I think when you find that you are at that inflection point, just to simply to George's point, have we? And more often than not, our first choice is not always the best decision.
Right, exactly.
Well, and I think
We have completely hijacked the panel. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
listen, this is all the goodness we wanted to happen. And I've learned that, you know, it's not hard to get a bunch of passionate DEI leaders talking either. So, but, you know, I mean, that's all I hear as well, right? The focus on leaders, and they're really going to be the boots on the ground to help you drive this message forward. But they're at wildly different places of like comfort and knowledge, right, on these topics. And certainly the last year has created more of a fear of, what do I say? I don't want to say the wrong thing. And then maybe I just won't say anything, which is also the wrong thing. And so just this whole like practical application piece is a big piece. So I'd say, you know, while that is going to be, you know, a marathon and not a sprint of ongoing work, right? How do the like business resource groups and employee resource groups inside an organization help be those other allies and boots on the ground? Like what would be some examples you could share that they are helping you move the needle?
I could probably jump on this one, James, and I saw you're about to answer, but I think that I'm deeply passionate and committed about this space because the employee networks were my gateway into diversity, right? So I mentioned I was in financial services. I was a registered trader. I have an MBA in finance, but I think throughout that journey, I found a community of people who genuinely cared about each other and lifting each other up as they rise throughout the organizations. So having been free staff for the diversity function wherever I've gone, I finally got tapped on the shoulder by my then CDO to say, what are you doing with your life? Like, you know, and when she tapped me on the shoulder, I was studying for the CFA level 1 that Saturday, which is like it's a 30% global pass rate and probably the gold standard in finance. And I never really thought about a career in diversity. But all I knew was BRGs, right? So I've probably spent 20 years leading, growing, developing BRGs, and you know, to the point where BRGs are effective is in their ability to amplify and mobilize, and the organization's commitment to empower them to help drive the change. Look, you have a group of employees who have raised their hand to help your diversity practitioner for free. Like, why would they do that? Right? They've got day jobs, but they're committed. And if we have an opportunity to amplify their voice, to keep us authentic, to help us drive change across the organization, both internally and externally, it's as I mentioned earlier, it's the ecosystem. Your BRG leaders should be out recruiting. Your BRG leaders should be having internal conversations around their shared and collective experience. They should be out with your community partners around volunteerism and philanthropy. All of that has to work together, or else you're going to have a number of frustrated employees who are spinning their wheels and the organization won't move.
I would always say that if you want to know if your organization is doing well or not, your canary in the cage is basically your ERGs. They're the one who's going to warn you. It's that simple. And to answer, actually, I think some of the questions that was brought on, Justin, you tapped on it. ERGs are one of the most powerful resources within an organization that empowers your employees' voice, as long as you create the right platform and capability for them to do so, to influence not just recruiting efforts, not just creating an internal community for any new employee, but also in ways it's a value proposition for if you know how to make it a value proposition as an organization. So when you think about ERGs, one of the things that I tend to ask people, do you have a vision that's clearly mapped out for employee resource group? That's the first thing I generally ask people when you think about it. Do you have it tied to the organization's work? Is it tied to their strategic
Right.
plan? Is it tied to the actual values of the organization? And we talk about the principles, right? That's a fundamental principle that we make sure that whatever efforts that is done through DEI, whether it's ERGs, whether it's any of the other areas, is it tied to the core principle of the organization? So if you have that clear path for your ERGs, that's where they're going to start making impact. And that's where you give them or guide them or help them realize that they can impact talent when it comes to recruiting. Again, creating a belonging environment. And I used one of my former companies. They actually had an ERG specialized that focused on new hires. That they're a group for new incoming teams. And basically, they would all be able to join into this new ERG and eventually grow into different areas. But they always had a network to walk into that welcomed them, that included them, that connected them when they first come in to all the necessary people that they need to know, and also had that sounding board, right? Because as you come into a new organization, that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. Who do I talk to? Where do I get the resources I need to get what I need to get done? And after that, how do I make sure that I stay here? And those are the people that you want to be able to talk to. Is going to be, again, where do you find them? Your ERGs. So there is a bit of sense of giving clear direction is critical for any ERGs, including impacting your way of practices.
Yeah, I agree with both of you so much. That I will say that was something of a learning curve for me, because the public sector had a different framework for what we call BRGs in the corporate sector. And by the way, I've heard you both use both ERGs and BRGs. I will tell you, Lockheed Martin, to its credit, made a very deliberate decision to move from ERGs, employee resource groups, to business resource groups. Exactly, James, for the reasons you articulated, actually. We wanted to embed the mission of our resource groups into the company mission, make it almost seamless. And to that, that's required work. I think a lot of us at first, a lot of our own BRGs did not understand, okay, what's the difference? What's the change now? Slowly but surely, we are integrating the actual mission of the company into the mission of our BRGs. That's not to exclude, by the way, the employee focus. That's always going to be very important. We want to hear their voice, but we can also leverage that voice for the benefit of performance outcomes for the company. So we have a whole framework that's set up with a leadership council and representatives of all of our BRGs on it, where they actually have the ear of the C-suite. I mean, it goes right up to our executive inclusion council. They can both deliver messages and receive messages down. And that's very, very powerful for our BRG. So appreciate the question, Tennille. It's a very important part of our work.
Yeah. Well, and Tessa asked a good question here in the chat that I think is important for us to touch on, because the whole remote scene, it's not going away anytime soon, right? I mean, for the foreseeable future, I think there's just going to be this remote element. And so, she's asking for someone getting started in D&I at a new organization right now. I would imagine that there's quite a few attendees who may be the very first D&I hire this company has ever had, right? And they're soaking up all the goodness from today. What are some ways with a remote environment we can create this sense of belonging and inclusion? And how's that played out for you all in the last year?
Yeah, I'd like to jump on that one, because we have developed a very innovative program that we're very proud of. And it just so happened, it preceded the pandemic. And it just so happens to answer the call for a remote virtual workforce beautifully when you're talking about inclusion. And it's about mentoring. It's about employee mentoring. One of the things that we did on our global diversity and inclusion team was develop a mentoring program, as many organizations have. But the unique thing about our program is that it has an entirely digital platform. So it lends itself to the fact that now we are not seeing each other for lunch or for coffee breaks. We are not being able to, touch each other in the hall as we're walking down the hall. We have to communicate and commune entirely virtually. And what this program does, the name of the program is WINGS, Working to Include, Network, and Grow Stronger, is to engage our remote workforce as though they were right next door, as though we could have lunch together, and have facilitated virtual mentoring sessions, provide tips on a monthly basis on what are the type of topics that are meaningful for both mentees and mentors, and how do we engage them in the fabric of the organization. The whole point of a mentoring program, in my view, is really to facilitate a sense of belonging. I think that's the very beginning of it. And on top of that, hopefully, we can help excel someone's career, develop their capabilities and so forth. But the first step is to make them feel a part of the organization, a sense of belonging. So I think mentoring is a great way to do it. And if you're fortunate enough to have a good resources and you can develop a digital platform for that, the possibilities are endless. You could have all kinds of resources and opportunities on a digital framework.
Resources being the key word there, right? Not
Yeah.
that the salary of the person they hired is the resource and now go make things D&I happen, right?
Yeah,
Like actual
agreed.
resources.
That's right.
Yeah, Justin, were you going to add something to that?
I would just say, look, I think that now more than ever, communication is the key, right? Georgia has this macro program that's amazing. So I'm writing that down, Georgia. I'm going to call you after this. We're going to, I think, look, I have daily meetings with my team. And I ask them, throughout, since we've been virtual, I've been across 2 different organizations, does this work for you? And people are starved for and want to communicate and want to have that interaction. But I think if we frame it both in the macro and the micro, right, those small messages that we send every day resonate that much more importantly, right? So if your leader is calling the return to office, return to work, we should check that behavior, right? We've been working. We just haven't just necessarily been in your office. We've been in our own. So it's communication is going to be critical. It's the same conversation we had earlier about BRGs. Like, how do we engage employees leveraging BRGs who might not be in a home office, right, or in a central location? Bringing that community together to feel valued and heard and provided for, whether the resources that we have available to your point, Tennille. But I think that if there's anything that this pandemic has taught us around inclusivity, is that we have this opportunity to engage everyone, right? We're not stuck in a conference room in a home office somewhere. Now we have this virtual platform where everybody can be part of the conversation. And I think that's the part that's exciting to me. To be able to move out of the conference room where you have, 25 to 100 people at a panel event after work. Now this is virtual and everyone can be a part of the conversation. So I think opening up that avenue, opening up those platforms and the mode and the style of communication is critically important.
I've seen a lot of cool things pop up, certainly, listening sessions, right? Post June, a lot of that going on. But I mean, one of the things that I've witnessed that I think is just a really awesome give that a lot of D&I leaders are doing is having a little, a small team coffee break, every other Friday and just keeping it at that 40, 50 person intentionally. And let's all talk about allyship and what that means, because the fear that just lives within people of being afraid to ask certain questions or what have you, to be able to go and be in a small and still have it feel like an intimate environment virtually, I think is so, you have to be intentional and purposeful to make that happen. But I think I've seen that be working really well too, across different organizations.
Hey, Tennille, may I just real quick, I just saw a question to me and I want to answer it because I want to be very, very clear about that. I think it was Dakisha asked, with regards to metrics, am I talking about hiring quotas? Of course not. We all know that hiring quotas are not permissible, are not legally allowed. What we are talking about is identifying barriers. And anyone who is in the EEO field knows that that's how we move the needle, is by removing barriers to equal opportunity, not by hiring quotas. And the analytics serve a key purpose, because until you know where are the drop-offs in diversity at various levels or in various subcomponents of the organization or in various occupational categories, until you know what the data says that there's a bottleneck here, there's a drop-off here, you don't know where the potential barriers are, and therefore you can't address those barriers and try to remove them. So thanks, Dakisha, for asking that. I want to be very clear about that.
The critical part, you can recruit diversity all day long, but that means nothing when they're not staying or the systems aren't supporting those candidates. Yeah. James, did you have something you were going to add to that?
Yeah, I was actually going to bring it all back a little bit. When you think about what Georgia just said about the importance of the metrics, but it also being very cognizant of the metric, right? One of the big things as people, as leaders tend to get lost in when it comes to DEI work is they see a metric, they're going to go after it. Whether they understand the why behind it and connecting it to the overall story and how we are going to make sure it leads to the right principles that we're trying to live, that's another situation. So reminding people on a regular basis what it means to be an inclusive leader. That branding piece, that marketing, and I use marketing, but it's marketing and branding in many ways. Is your leaders talking about inclusion every single day in the organization? Are they talking about the value of diversity in the organization? We can talk. I've been blessed to have the experience of different organizations who every meeting they start off with something about safety or something about that the tenets of the organization. Can DEI be part of that first tenet of the conversation, right? And then with that, metric is there to support it. It's a lagging indicator. It is not the goal. The goal is to create the best environment where anyone can come into an organization and truly be valued. And we as leaders being cognizant of our biases to truly select a diverse population of people that help drive us that are different than us. Because the reality, that's when you truly create a powerful organization that can evolve with the times. So I would say that is one of the big pieces that when people keep talking about what are the metrics you're going to measure and stuff like that, yes, those are important. Not going to argue. And I'm also going to say, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. The metrics are there. Just like hiring, there's metrics for hiring. There's metrics for engagement. They're all there. It's just tweaking it with a lens, a diversity lens. But that's pretty much it. Outside of that,
in finance, we call it driving while looking in the rearview mirror.
Exactly. Perfect.
You're not going to drive your car looking in the rearview mirror.
Right. Yeah. Lagging into indicators. That's exactly what they are. They're, what was the impact of what we did? What was the impact yesterday?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, James, you can't finish up without repeating the 4 Ps. We had a question where Manuel wants you to repeat what your 4 Ps were again that you had shared.
Absolutely. It's principles, practices, policies, and accommodations. So it's actually A at the end. But one thing I will also say, and this is something for, I always tell people, it's a pass-fail way of measuring, but is it a culture add or is it a culture fit? Whatever your decision you're making, that's your pass. That's how I usually look at it as a pass-fail. Whether it's a talent acquisition perspective or whether, is this going to be a culture add? Is it a culture fit? And if it's
James, I think on the culture piece, I remember we were having this conversation at another firm. The question is always, well, what's the right culture value add? Like, what are we looking to change? And I told one senior leader one time, I was like, well, adding more culture and cultures is never a minus. How you add it will indicate where you are, but increasing the diverse perspectives that you have available to make decisions is never going to be a minus.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And there's so many great speakers. I know, Charlene, I know you're here and your beautiful face will pop back on, but can you make sure we get these questions? I'd love to make sure we could get to all of them. I know we're at time. So for those that we didn't answer, I'm sorry, I see them, they're awesome. And I'd love for us to have a chance to at least follow up with those folks.
Yes, I mean, certainly there's like 10 or 11 questions. Georgia was really on top of it, spotting them, and I was trying to let you guys know that they were coming in, but obviously I wish we had a lot more time to be able to go over this and share with the team and with everyone in the audience today. We'll get those questions over. I'll email those over to you guys, and feel free, after the panel, you could certainly hop back into the Engages platform and you can direct message anyone. So if you see a comment here, Georgia, you could send a note, right, to someone directly and say, hey, Dean, go a little bit more in depth. Same, Justin and James, and I think that would be a huge opportunity. Tennille, you've been great at sticking to time. I do believe we're still setting up our keynote coming up next, which is Alan Neville. So if you guys have any kind of closing remarks while we make sure that Alan is secure in the Zoom, is there anything you want to mention, for 30-second closing remark for the audience?
You three have at it. I think if anybody from my team is watching, they're shocked I actually did this in a time frame that I was supposed to do it. So,
Well done.
You three go around real fast.
I have one, because I think it'll two things, Charlene, to your point, right? I think there's one question there that I'm deeply passionate about. It's what can you suggest if you have no budget to manage your D&I? And I can tell you that your organization will spend money on the things that it values. And if they're not resourcing you with talent or dedicated resources or budget, you're going to be pushing a rock up a hill. And I guess if your organization values it, they'll resource it accordingly. In the same way that, look, the role of the diversity practitioner is you wouldn't hire a CFO without expertise in this space, right? You can't crowdsource D&I. So you need this dedicated resources and budget, and you're not going to go tell your CEO that go run the organization. We're not going to give you any tools to do it. Same thing with the diversity space. You have to spend the money and allocate the resources to get anything done.
Thank you, Justin. Very quickly from James in Georgia.
For me, it's quite simple in the space of, again, culture ads versus culture fit. When you think about that pass fail, when you think about all the things that you're bringing forth, whether it's hiring, whether it's things that you're going to institute, is it truly going to be an ad? Is it going to be just a fit? Georgia?
Very quickly, if 2020 showed us anything and taught us anything, is that we have more work to do. We still have to face the issues that led to the social unrest. We have to face the issues that led to George Floyd. We have to face issues that are popping up every day on the news with regard to racial inequity. And we have to face them in our workplace because they are not isolated outside the doors of our companies. So I encourage you to have these conversations with your employees as we do. Listen to them. There is therapeutic value in just having the conversation, and then we can start working on correcting it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you guys so much. And I do believe Alan is ready for his keynote coming up next. Lots of talking points here. I'm sure people have pages and pages worth of notes so far today. So thank you all so much. With that, I wish you a great rest of your day. Wave you goodbye as we welcome Alan. And let me know if you need anything throughout the day. Thank you, guys.